Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, the place that is now known as Sydney, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us tonight. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks. I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the Library, and it is my pleasure this evening to host on behalf of the Library this edition of History Matters. History Matters is a collaboration between the State Library of New South Wales, the Professional Historians Association, New South Wales and ACT, and the Oral History Association of New South Wales. And each month, those two professional bodies bring you a vast array of speakers talking about different aspects about the art and craft of history. And tonight, it's all about disasters. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions for the speakers this evening. And if you do have any questions, you can just type them in the chat feature on Zoom, and your host, Scott, will be taking those questions and asking the speakers after their brief chats this evening. Scott comes to us from the University of Wollongong tonight, and he's also the Vice President of the Oral History Association of New South Wales, and he's your chair. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. And as Rachel says, I'm at the University of Wollongong, and I'll begin by acknowledging that I live and work on unceded Darawal, Yuin and Wadi Wadi country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Excuse me. So the historiography of disasters in Australia is surprisingly limited. Disasters have often been seen simply as natural or as acts of God, and therefore outside the remit of historians investigating the history of human societies. That began to change in Australia firstly with histories of bushfire written by historians including Stephen Pine and Tom Griffiths, and more recently there have been flood histories by Emily O'Gorman, histories of drought by Deb Anderson and Rebecca Jones. And they, along with a range of other scholars, have started to add much needed detail to our understanding of disaster in Australian history, including our pre-colonial history through which Indigenous peoples developed very different relationships to and knowledges of fire and flood, knowledges which are still very much alive today. So in particular, I think disaster histories can add to our understanding of the human role in exacerbating or causing disaster, as well as the ongoing impacts of disaster on individual lives, families and communities. And the increasing impacts of climate change made apparent by the devastating 2019-2020 fire season, and the likelihood of more frequent and more intense disasters in the future adds growing urgency to this research. So in the last couple of years, our two presenters tonight have made significant and highly valuable contributions to the historiography of Australian disasters, and I'm just delighted that we've been able to have them join us for this History Matters. So our first presenter is Dr. Margaret Cook, and Margaret is a history lecturer at the University of Sunshine Coast and Honorary Research Fellows at La Trobe University and University of Queensland, and a consultant historian who's worked in the heritage, museum, government and private sectors. Her recent books are A River with a City Problem, A History of Brisbane Floods, and a collection that Margaret and I edited together, which is called Disasters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophe, and it looks very much like that. I've been told I should hold it up. So Margaret, welcome, and I will hand things over to you.
Thank you, Scott, for that lovely introduction. And I'm speaking to you from Yagara country in Ipswich, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that they have been the keepers of flood stories in this region for centuries. And thank you very much to the State Library for the opportunity to speak on this panel with Peg and Scott. Australia is extremely prone to flooding, most of all in New South Wales and Queensland. Now, for some people, memories of floods begin to fade as soon as the water goes down. Others carry these memories as lifelong scars. For those who have only lived in the region in dry years, floods may not register at all in their environmental consciousness. Scholars have shown that memory is an important educative tool in helping people cope with floods, and it is here that I think historians have a role to play. Floods will come again, and history has the potential to help people prepare and recover for the next inundation. As we acknowledge in the series title, History Matters. So there are 3 points that I want to raise tonight for discussion and questions. One is the role of history in raising public understanding of floods. The second is how can history help demystify the science of floods? And finally, the power of history. So let's look first at what I see as the role of historians in disaster studies. Flood research is often left to scientists and engineers in the ongoing search to solve flooding. Not only can scientific and policy documents be selective in fact, they can reduce floods to simplistic accounts, and they can obscure the cultural, socioeconomic, legal and technical factors involved. In my example of floods, a flood policy or a manual creates a world without humans, politics, cultural values and economics, a fallacy that ignores the cultural dimensions of science. What historians can do is uncover the complexities of the flood, record the conflicting narratives and myths, add the human and non-human dimensions to the hydrological event, and seek lessons from the past. Historians weave together facts with culture, social values, ethics, and disparate voices to tell a more complicated story, to expose the connectivity between the individual parts and players, to show the relationships. In doing so, historians recognise that floods and bushfires are not natural events, but a complex combination of nature and socio-economic and cultural factors. The separation of nature and culture can perpetuate environmental ignorance or cultural blindness that can be fatal. Flood historians can be very unpopular as they can uncover uncomfortable truths. Historians are trained to hear different voices that might run counter to dominant and more popular narratives. Not surprisingly, state and local governments do not always respond well to having their culpability exposed. A troublesome historian revealing that they have allowed building in floodplains does not always go down well. The prevailing myth that Wivenhoe Dam will save Brisbane from floods is far more palatable, especially in a city with a history of pro-development. Flood stories can be difficult to tell, difficult to hear and to record, but I believe it is incumbent on historians to do so. We owe it to those who have lost their lives or their loved ones, their livelihoods and their treasured possessions, and we do need to try and improve the future. But my research has shown that there is a level of community ignorance about floods that makes adaptation and resilience less likely. And that leads me to my second point tonight. How can history help demystify the science of floods? Now, engineers and hydrologists talk in cumecs, megalitres and flow rates. They refer to a 1 in 100 year flood. For some like me with little science, this can be challenging and daunting at times. What does this all mean? At best it can be confusing, but at other times it can cause panic. Hydrologists talk of flood waves, which for the layperson conjures up an image of a tsunami bearing down on them, when a flood practitioner can mean a relatively benign flood peak. There are other examples where technical language can be detrimental to getting people to react to an imminent flood. For example, flood forecasters refer to minor, moderate and maximum floods. The fairly innocent sounding moderate flood can cause people to relax, although serious damage can still occur. specialist knowledge is not shared by all. As an example, Brisbane floods might be recorded along the lines of 9 metres at the Brisbane flood gauge. Now, many of us can't conceptualise 9 metres, and I shocked flood managers when I confessed that, like many other locals, I had absolutely no idea where the flood gauge was located. For the record, it's hidden on the side of a city building in Edward Street, but I'd never noticed it. Equally, many people don't realise that rivers are sloped. A 9-metre flood at the mouth of the river may well be 20 metres upstream, as in the case in Brisbane. This misunderstanding causes complacency, as people are unaware of the impending danger and they don't leave their homes. Simply put, flood warnings don't always work. I think there is a vital role for historians to help translate the technical knowledge and disseminate it to the community. In doing so, future flood warnings might be more effective. People can plan and possibly evacuate, saving lives and possessions. Historians can bring experience and memory to disaster studies that can contribute to research, empower local people, inform policy, and communicate and make risk understandable. And that leads me to my third and final point, the power of history. People remember stories, and a well-told story can enter the public consciousness. It is the role of historians to tell stories, record history accurately, supported by archival research, oral history, facts, and scientific data to inform the public. A story of a flood reaching the bottom of a local bridge or submerging a local church when the water reached 9 metres will have more community impact than a scientific report, and it can be shared with future generations in oral or written traditions. I've been a public historian and a member of the Professional Historians Association in Queensland for 30 years, and my scholarship has always had a public face. I think it's important to embrace all genres of history: books, academic articles, podcasts, webinars, public talks, museums, social media, and anything else you can think of. All have merit. To me, the difference is not academic rigour, but a matter of audience and the appropriate strategy for the task at hand. When stories of floods are shared in various formats in engaging ways, they begin to change dominant narratives. Brisbane's dominant historical accounts have largely overlooked the river and generally ignored floods. When Brisbane opened for free settlement in 1842, Aboriginal people warned settlers of the risk of floods, pointing to debris in the trees only from the year before. Dreaming stories recorded even larger floods. Yet the settlers ignored the warnings. Perhaps it was too difficult for British eyes to comprehend. Settlers arrived with a poor understanding of the region's climate and hydrological cycles. When floods did arrive in 1893, 2 of the largest floods on record, the solution was to build a dam to control the water. When Somerset Dam failed to withhold floodwaters in 1974, the government and the community looked to a new dam to withhold the floods, Wivenhoe Dam, which is 3 times larger than Somerset Dam. And when it opened in 1985, it promoted a myth that Brisbane was now floodproof. Intense development of the floodplain followed as the city placed its faith in Wivenhoe Dam. When the 2011 floods submerged Brisbane nearly 10 years ago, many blamed the dam operators. The floods were framed as human-created and preventable, caused by human error, namely the failure to release the water correctly. This myth allows floodplain development to flourish and ignores the reality that floods cannot be prevented. The default position remains that humans should not be defeated by nature. Brisbane has a strange relationship with its river. The city calls itself the River City in promotional material, but for decades the city turned its back on the river. From the British settlement, the river was used for transport and effluent dump and fuel, and mined for its gravel and sand that created the concrete to build the city on its banks. The floodplain provided alluvial soil for farming, grand riverside homes and low-lying sites for industry and cheap housing. In more recent years, boardwalks and modern buildings embrace the city. The city river cat ferries move people around the place. But the river is still largely seen as an aesthetic feature, a brown serpentine water body that bisects the city. After decades of dredging, truncating, cutting and damming, many thought floods would never happen again. In the 21st century mindset, rivers are tamed, reduced to the predictability of a canal. Learning from history may change that mindset. Floods occur quite regularly, but in Brisbane, smaller floods are withheld in the dams. It is now only the maximum floods that impact the city. But with climate change, the likelihood is that floods will become more frequent and larger. With increasing floodplain development, the devastation will be more severe. Historians have a role to play in public education, so the community is more attuned to the climate, the risk of flood, and actions people can take to minimise the damage. My argument is that we need to change human behaviour through responsible floodplain development and not always seek to control the river through dams and weirs. I believe that history has an important role in raising flood consciousness. It has the potential to alter government policy and change human behaviour, or at least foster an acceptance that floods are a natural cycle that needs to be accommodated by humans. In conclusion, the theme of tonight is that history matters. And I would say that history is an important tool in flood management. By recording and telling the history of past events, we will make people conscious of the chance of future floods, which might make them more prepared. In the case of floods, history might just help save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for that lovely talk. And I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Peg Fraser. But just a reminder, if you do have questions, to put them in the, you can start putting them in the chat or Q&A at the moment, and we'll get to those after Peg's talk. So Dr. Peg Fraser is a research associate at Museums Victoria. Her award-winning book, Black Saturday, Not the End of the Story, is based on oral history she gathered for the Victorian Bushfires collection at Museum Victoria. Peg now lives in the Adelaide Hills and is a volunteer with bushfire relief efforts. And I'll hand over to you, Peg.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Margaret. You've given me my new favorite expression, troublesome historian. I begin by acknowledging the Paramankangana people, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing in the Adelaide Hills, and I offer my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. When I was invited to speak tonight, Paula asked me if I would talk about what oral history can bring to disaster history. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective from Margaret's and talk more about the craft of history, particularly oral history, which is what I'm familiar with. She also asked me to be short and sharp. So I could be really short and just say that oral history brings to disaster history what it brings to every historical project. And that's true, but I think there's a particular synergy between the two areas that can make a really significant contribution to our understanding of disasters, both natural and man-made. And I realize that oral history has a particular significance for the libraries in Australia because they are the major repositories of many, many very important oral history collections. The first thing that oral history brings is the personal perspective. It tells in intimate, fine-grained detail of the experiences of people who have been affected by disaster. It brings big events down to human relatable scale. It makes them personal. It also makes them complicated. So many of us receive our news in short sound bites and spectacular images, and history is an antidote to that. in an interview, the kind of survivor response you might hear in a news bulletin, you know, just that few seconds of emotion and reaction, opens out into the complex portrait of a person for whom that news item is a lived reality, and into the many ways that disaster changes the course of their life. And that's what my title, The Intersection of Grief and History, is referring to. That juxtaposition of intense personal experience with major events like bushfire, flood, or earthquake. I wish I'd thought of that turn of phrase, but I didn't. It was coined by James Gardner, a curator at the Smithsonian Institution, in the months after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. This focus on the intimate and personal is perhaps the most familiar contribution oral history makes, and it's a very powerful tool for exploring and communicating the human dimension of disaster, and of connecting people inside and outside the disaster zone. Increasingly, though, I've come to regard this as a departure point for thinking about the role of oral history in the time of disaster, and that there are more ways that oral history contributes to disaster history. Yeah, as Margaret had referred to just a few minutes ago, in the aftermath of Black Saturday, there seemed to be a single narrative that dominated the public domain, that of resilience and recovery, of community rebuilding and looking to the future with renewed determination. When I started to interview people in Strathewen, a small settlement that was badly hit by Black Saturday, I heard stories that supported that narrative, but I also heard stories of community dysfunction and conflict, of personal anger and resentment and hopelessness, of increased substance abuse and domestic violence. I started to think of this as an alternative narrative, but I quickly realized that I was hearing not one alternative, but many different narratives, each one as valid and as important as the popular story of loss and recovery. And these different stories were told through the foundational concept of oral history, the life history. By asking survivors to tell me not just about the day of the bushfire, but about their lives before and since, I realized that people's life situations and experiences had an enormous influence on what happened through the fires and how they responded in the years after, and in the kind of stories they told themselves and others in the attempt to make sense of what happened. Life stories revealed unexpected connections and contradictions and can lead to insights that are not possible in shorter event-focused interviews. And this is especially true if they're conducted over time, because as I'm sure every oral historian will tell you, stories don't stand still. Every oral history interview is a product not only of the individual and the events they're talking about, but also of what has happened since, the audience, and the relationship between the oral historian and the narrator. I've worked with narrators whose stories have changed dramatically, sometimes reflecting complete reversals in attitudes and life decisions, as they gain distance from the fires and as their own circumstances change. Now, this can be a challenge when you're trying to write history and you've got a deadline. But not only is it absolutely normal, it's often a sign of personal recovery. As a matter of fact, I worried about those narrators who stuck rigidly, sometimes word for word, to a particular description of events, because it seemed to me that such adherence was masking unresolved issues. Oral history suggests that the story of disaster is far denser and more complicated and takes far longer than the popular narrative of recovery suggests. And we need to examine and try to understand those complexities, because in that way we will be able not only to better deal with future disasters, but also better understand ourselves and our society. Oral history also brings with it a strong sense of place. The life histories I collected in Strathewen included details of the environment that only locals would know. Early settlement patterns, how the orchards gave way to lifestyle acreages, the family stories of earlier bushfires. People wanted me to know where the primary school had stood, and the old hall, and the ritual of walking from one to the other for the annual Christmas concert, of where they built cubbies and rode horses and watched platypus play in the creek. They spoke of the effects of the drought, the impact of the fires on a familiar landscape, and their sense of belonging. And this sense of place is but a reflection of the deep knowledge and commitment that Indigenous people have to country. Tom Griffiths has been arguing for a long time that our response to bushfire must be based on local knowledge, not on national frameworks or protocols. The past summer has taught us many things, but one of them is that bushfire in Queensland rainforest is not the same as bushfire in Victoria's mountain ash. And we need the fine grain of lived experience, both Indigenous and settler, to contribute to our understanding of what we have lost and what is still at stake, and how to go forward from here. And just a quick note, the picture in the background here is one I took just a couple of weeks ago up in Charleston, which is where the Cuddly Creek bushfires swept through the Adelaide Hills at the end of last year. So 10 months on, you can see that there's a lovely brand new fence there, courtesy of Blaze Aid, and the grasses are regenerating, but it is unlikely that that grove of she oaks will recover. And as I continue to work with oral history in the aftermath of disaster, I'm increasingly aware of something else. I think oral history influences not just what we write about disasters, the elements of personal experience and the emergence of multiple narratives, but how we write it. As I think we all know, the way in which we write and speak, the language, the structure, the tone, makes a difference. When I was writing my book about the 2009 bushfires, I really struggled with how to write about Black Saturday itself. And even though the chapter about the day the fires went through Strathewen is the first one in the book, it was the last one I wrote. There are really good examples of bushfire narrative. Peter Stanley, Karen Kassane, and Adrian Hyland have all written powerful accounts about Black Saturday. But I didn't want to do that. It seemed to me that the process of narrative, of putting the story into the third person, of imposing a narrative arc, saying this happened and then meanwhile this was happening somewhere else, of making the event comprehensible to readers, also somehow gives an illusion of distance from and control over the fire. And this was not what my narrators were telling me. When the fire came through, there was total chaos. Day became night, direction was meaningless, time stood still, the very air around them burned. A disaster is by definition terrifying and beyond control. And to corral, to control this story by putting it into a conventional narrative structure would, I thought, diminish the reader's understanding of the immensity and the force and the fear. I wanted readers of my book to share, even if only in some tiny measure, some of the chaos and confusion of that day. So I juxtaposed hundreds of very short excerpts, sometimes just a couple of words each, from more than 20 oral histories to tell what happened in Strathewen on the 7th of February. The narrators are not identified in the text, so the story jumps from person to person, from those who left early to those who stayed and defended, to those who fled at the last moment, to those outside Strathewen who were waiting and watching and hoping. There is a rough chronology, but no explanation, no interpretation. The chapter is deliberately unsettling and confusing and confronting because I hope it represents a little bit of what it was like to be there. So, in summary, and I hope I've been sufficiently short and sharp, oral history can offer a perspective on disaster that is personal and empathetic, that respects many different experiences, that understands that there are no simple narratives or neat endings in life, that is intensely local, and that can lead to different kinds of storytelling. I believe that in the climate change future we face, we will need this kind of history making more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Peg. That was wonderful as always. And I'll ask Margaret to put her screen back on, and I'll welcome Margaret back. And here we all are. Great. So, and a reminder to everyone to please pop your questions in the Q&A section, either for Peg or Margaret or both. and we can work those through and have a chat. So our first question has just popped in, and it says, I found Peg's life history approach to disaster interviews very salient. I know all three of you have done oral histories in relation to disaster. Could each of you share your experience of a project and reflect on how long should an interview be in these circumstances, short, long, or a series of interviews? How long after the disaster is optimal given changing narratives, and what have you learnt, and would you change the approach in the future?
Well, that's a whole other session.
That is a lot of wonderful questions, so thank you for those. Peg, given that you are in the mindset of talking about oral history after your talk, do you want to maybe address that first question of is there an ideal length of an interview? Should it be done over a series of interviews? What are the kind of practicalities there?
Yeah, I had a couple of different approaches to doing oral history interviews, which were, excuse me, very much dependent on the frame of mind of the narrator. I have to say, when you're talking about difficult subjects, whether it's disasters or other difficult parts of people's lives, it is exhausting work. And I would say that 2 hours was the absolute outside, and that was working with people who were quite calm and collected and understood what they were doing. So usually between 1.5 hours to 2 hours. I think that doing a series of interviews, if you have the resources to do it, because often collecting projects are quite short term. They've got a finite limit to the funding, to the personnel resources that can be committed to it. But I think there's incredible value in doing a series of interviews over time. Some of the most revealing and significant conversations happened when I went back to people a year later and said, what's going on with your life now? And I believe, I know there's been a lot of discussion about how soon do you get out into the, and I think that there is value to be had in oral history interviews at almost every stage of recovery or even before recovery, of relief and recovery from disasters, whether it's immediate or short-term or longer-term or even many years later.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think particularly that point about the value that how stories change over time, and I think it's a great reminder that the disaster, the place of the disaster in people's lives changes over time. So in going back, and we're not just talking to people about what happened on the day or the night of the fire, but we're talking to people about what role does the disaster still play in your life, and we know that people's recovery from disaster isn't kind of a steady progression, but is more like hills and peaks, and so people's understanding of the disaster, the place of it in their lives, is going to change over time. Margaret, I know that oral history wasn't as centred in your project as it was in Peg's, but from the oral histories that you did, you have a sense of things that you learnt through that, and would you change the approach at all in the future?
Yeah. I would like to echo a lot of what Peg says. The interviews are traumatic. I have cried, and so have the people I've interviewed. And so 1.5 hours is my optimum, because unless it's showing photographs or walking through a site, it's very confronting. And the thing with perspective, if you can come back, they offer an opportunity for different information to be presented, but also different questions to be asked. I've had people who have said, with the benefit of hindsight, I would, which you can't do obviously shortly after the event, but they serve different purposes. And I think I think any oral history at any moment is valuable. They're just got to be treated differently depending on when you're doing them. I've tended to just do single interviews. A few times I've gone back. Then you get the issue of repetition and changing, and Peg beautifully manages that process of analysing the change, which I think is very interesting too.
Yeah. So our next question connects to that. It's how do you deal with the trauma that you are bearing witness to during your interviews? Peg, do you want to start there?
Okay. All right, I think there are I can think of at least three aspects of that. I think the first is the distress caused to the narrator by revisiting, in some cases reliving what happened to them on what was probably the worst day in their whole life. And so at the museum, we had a lot of support built into our project for the narrators. So I had discussions with all of the narrators, extended discussions, before we even approached the idea of doing an interview. There were a handful of people that I had coffee with for 4 years before they finally decided they could trust me enough to record an interview. We talked about, and so I was very clear about the effect that they could possibly experience during the interview and after the interview. And we, you know, I know there are some oral historians who say never turn the recorder off, but I did. I allowed, that's a dreadful word, I encouraged the narrators to be in control of what they said and when they said and what was recorded. And we also did follow-up. So I would be on the phone the next day asking them how they're feeling. And I should add, at the end of the interview, you know, we were always talking about what kind of support have you got? You know, if I was talking to somebody, particularly a sole narrator, because I did a number of interviews with 2 people, particularly a sole narrator, what are you going to do? Have you got somebody coming past the house? Are you going to be okay? And then I'd follow up the following day and into the following weeks. The second thing, of course, is the effect on the interviewer, on the historian. It is really hard work to do this kind of thing. I believe you have to be in a good place yourself before you can start to do it. And there's absolutely no shame in stepping back and saying, I can't do that kind of story. That's too far from me. And again, the museum had really good support in place. So we had access to a counselor if we needed it. I think for me, what made a big difference is that there were 3 of us working on the bushfires collection at the same time. So we knew what each of us was going through in a way that the other curators, as supportive and as interested as they were, could not appreciate. And having that kind of peer support from people who we were talking about black humor earlier, with whom you could share black humor and know that they would not be shocked. That was really, really important. And I think the third thing is the distress it can cause within the collecting institution. And our transcriber had lived through the Ash Wednesday bushfires. So for her to be listening to these interviews and transcribing them was also very difficult. So we made the counseling service available to her, but it has a real downstream effect to collection managers, to curators who have to sit in an acquisitions meeting and hear talk of death and destruction. And I think that all collecting institutions need to be aware of that.
Yeah, Margaret, your work was done as part of a PhD when you were researching the Brisbane floods. Does that change the dynamics? Is there support in place if you're dealing with doing very difficult interviews around difficult subject matter?
No, you need to call on. I called on my friends and quite a lot. So yeah, I think it's very important to debrief. It doesn't really matter who it's with. I would have loved the opportunity for colleagues, but you need family and friends. And I agree, you need to be in a good mental place yourself. And you don't know what's going to come. This is a different project, but I interviewed a man who'd gone through the Box Flat disaster, which is a mining disaster in Ipswich. And I talked tonight about the scars. He literally lifted up his shirt and showed me his scars and then burst into tears. And I did turn off the tape because it traumatized him and that was 25 years on. So you don't know when that raw emotion is going to come out.
That's another great point about when do you do an interview? It might be 25 years later and that trauma is still very real in people's lives. Yeah. So the next question is a good one, but it might be something that you haven't had a chance to put a lot of thought into yet. This is, as we face the current disaster of COVID-19, what role does history have to put it in context and to correct the existing narratives or counter-narratives about its significance? Is it a matter for history or for contemporary discourse? Do you have thoughts on that question? I guess this relates to that question around, writing the history of quite recent disasters. What's the line between this being a history and this contributing to the contemporary discourse around the disaster? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
I suppose to take up on Peg's point, it's a question, I think, at this stage of collecting the information as much as analysing information. Historians' jobs is to, as part of that, is collection of history as well. So I would suggest that maybe you need some distance to maybe analyse it, but now is opportunity for that collection phase.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing historians at work. There's been a lot of attention given to the Spanish flu, 1919,
Absolutely.
and drawing comparisons, and I think that's really valuable. I'd also suggest that I don't think history or cultural discourse is an either-or proposition. I think it's both, and sometimes the lines are blurred. When I was halfway through my PhD on Black Saturday, one of my supervisors said, "Well, this is all very interesting, but I don't think it's history." And my heart fell because I thought, what am I doing here? It's not history. And he said, well, it's just kind of a mix of history and cultural analysis and a bit of sociology and a little anthropology. He said, I don't know what it is, but it's not history, but whatever it is, keep doing it. And so I think, we are finding that disciplinary boundaries are blurring, and that it is, cultural analysis is a significant part of history making now.
I think
similarly, I was told that I would drift too much into policy or public administration. And I think, to me, that was something I wanted to contribute, is that I think we can talk about floods as a way of need to manage or inform policy decision is what I do. And I know our colleague, Daniel May, looks at that with bushfires. And I think that's another role that you can do with COVID at the moment, that you can use lessons from the Spanish flu and others, SARS, to inform policy and change the debate as well. But yeah. I agree, the boundaries are blurred, which is why I like environmental history, because it allows me to blur boundaries a lot.
Definitely. And I know that I'm doing some interviews at the moment with people about the Currawin fires and from January this year and the impacts on Kangaroo Valley, and those interviews can't help but also be about COVID-19, because people's recovery process at the moment is in so many ways defined by COVID-19. And in some ways that's a positive. It's given people, everything's kind of been a bit shut down and given people a little bit of peace and quiet to kind of process the issue. In other ways, it's been really difficult because one person talked to me about, she just wants to give everybody a big hug and she can't do that at the moment. And so those kind of limits on the recovery process. And so any history, I think, of the 2019-2020 fires is just not going to be easily divided from a history of COVID-19 as well. So the next question is for Margaret, just checking the time here. Yeah, we're still okay. So this question is, Margaret, given the inadequacy of language to describe flood severity, for example, moderate, are there better language or semiotic frames that could better carry the urgency?
I think there are, but then also the other is to just educate what that terminology actually means. I think to put that onto tangible things works a lot better. For example, overseas, they are much better at recording flood markers and translating that into an interpretive plaque or something that will allow people to understand what it means. There's been a conscious decision in Brisbane to not make it so transparent. So that language I think, has been deliberately a little confused. So I think there's an education process. So the language, I think, is at fault. And flood inquiries have found that it doesn't help. But if in the dry times you try and help with that translation process, it might help. The problem is no one wants to talk about floods when it's dry. And now wanting to talk about COVID-19, and in January they wanted to talk about bushfires. So we'll talk about floods probably when it's too late, when the water's actually rising.
Fixing the roof, the leaky roof when the rain comes.
Yeah.
Such a good point. And you were talking about, keeping the memory of the floods alive through our research as historians. But if the memories that we're keeping alive are difficult ones, getting people to engage with the message, I guess, is a challenge. So our next question, quite rightly, begins that both were super papers, thank you. And they say, I'm wondering what you feel about the boundary between oral history interviews and therapy. I'm asking this because in 2017, I conducted many interviews with people who'd experienced the Hazelwood coal mine fire and thought about this often uncomfortably during that process. Peg, you reacted strongly to that question.
Oh, yeah. Look, this is something that's been... I've had many robust discussions about this. And partly it stems from the fact that when Museum Victoria set up the Victorian Bushfires collection in 2009, part of the collecting statement says that the role of the museum is to contribute to community healing. And I've always been really, really uncomfortable with that for a number of reasons. And I think that there has been a lot of discussion in oral history papers about the difference between oral history and therapy. And some of the language that is used in oral history research does make me uncomfortable. Things like closure, words like this, that we're borrowing from the psychological sciences, and that I certainly don't feel qualified or comfortable using. I think Sean Field, who worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, I think put it best that oral history can be a mechanism by which narrators come to terms with what has happened to them and begin to resolve it. But it's actually a very individual process, that it is entirely up to the narrator. The oral historian is a witness to it and not an agent of it. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. So somebody, a narrator may decide that an oral history interview has been therapeutic for them, but I don't believe that historians or collecting institutions should be setting out with therapy in mind.
Yeah, I feel very much the same way. And I think one of the big issues is, well, as for a starting point, I'm not trained as a therapist, but as a second point, I'm not there next week or the week after that. Therapy is a process. And our interviews might have a kind of cathartic value for people who, the value of being heard, having someone to very carefully sit down and listen to your story might have a value. But yes, I agree, very uncomfortable with the idea that we are kind of solving people's problems through this, or the difficulties that they might be having through this. Margaret, did you have thoughts on that question?
I need to echo what you've said, is that it's not therapy, unless it's, and it's not for us either, as the interviewer.
So the next question also asks about the entanglement of oral accounts with other accounts. So both speakers mentioned that the state has commissioned scientific reports which are in marked contrast to the personal stories. How do you see the entanglements between official accounts and the personal oral accounts? Margaret, did you want to start off with that one? Yeah,
well, to me, the oral history has a number of important contributions there, in that it can offer a different narrative for a start, and it can complicate that narrative, and there are dissenting voices that are usually not covered in these government documents in particular. And the other thing is that, as Peg said, the beauty of oral history is it gets down to that individual level. You can relate at that place or that point in time or that person's particular narrative, whereas the policy documents are always from on high. And the grassroots historian is in me is always interested in the oral history or the diary or the letter that brings that personal story. And I think readers like personal stories that they can relate to far more. So I think that's the value, that you need both.
Right. Peg, did you have anything to add there?
No, I just absolutely echo Margaret's statement that you do need both. One of the really interesting things about oral history is looking at the places where it diverts from the mainstream account. And Sandro Cortelli, who sort of is the father of this kind of thinking in oral history, said that, you know, sometimes what matters most are the mistakes that people make consciously, unconsciously, and the way that they diverge from what we consider to be truth, as in the scientific reports, the police reports, and that sort of thing. And I certainly found that some of the most revealing aspects of doing oral history research is looking at what the differences are.
If I could just add one anecdote to illustrate that. I had the story in Brisbane is the celebration of the Mud Army after the 2011 floods, when all the people of Brisbane poured onto the streets to help. And it's celebrated as a great success story. And it was a successful story, except when you go and talk to people, you find out that they all went to the same street and it was complete chaos. And there was no management of the process at all. It was just people literally pouring into the streets with no idea what to do. Now that doesn't come through the official documentation at all. It's only when you go and interview people who are either in the Mud Army or recipients of the Mud Army that you start getting that story of chaos and confusion that's smoothed over in the official documents.
So we are rapidly running out of time, but there are a couple of other great questions that I'm hoping we might quickly get to. The next question is from someone who again says thank you for this, and they have worked in emergency management themselves. And are often talking to people in emergency management about the need to listen to historians and draw on history. So the questioner asks, I'm wondering what the experience has been to date with historians engaging with the emergency management sector, and what do you think the emergency management sector could do to support historians further in ensuring we record and preserve our disaster history? Have either of you worked closely with emergency management or had emergency management engage with your research since the disaster in either positive or negative ways?
Today I did. I would have said no yesterday. Right. But the emergency manager in Ipswich City Council today gave a presentation and quoted and held up my book and said that it had actually informed their work. So there you go. And I did, when I did my oral history work, quite closely interviewing members of the SES, but it has gone no further. But Peg, how about you?
Well, actually, my voice is a bit scratchy today because I spent yesterday training as a Red Cross emergency relief volunteer. Huh. And I live in a bushfire-prone zone, and the next bushfire that comes through will see me actively working in a relief center. And it was really interesting, you know, explaining my background to people. And the response on a very casual level, it was extremely supportive and really interested in what we have found, we as historians are finding. And I think there is a sense that we're you know, the situation is becoming increasingly of concern in terms of the climate, and we need all hands on deck, even historians.
Absolutely. So one last question is quite a big one, but we might have to give it quite a short answer to. The question is, how do you decide what information you keep when researching and writing about such sensitive topics, and what gets left out? Peg, you've written about this as one of the questions you deal with. In fact, it's part of your chapter in this book.
Look, it comes down to judgment. You've got to balance things out, and you have to consider the cost to the narrator, the benefit to the narrator, the potential benefit to our wider understanding of disasters. And honestly, in the end, you put all your experience and knowledge on the line and hope you're right. Hope you make the right choice.
And do you identify or not identify people is another approach of, you know, if they want to be on the public record with names or not is another ethical issue to discuss.
It is, although when you're working with a really small group of people the way I was, I said, look, I can use a pseudonym for you, but everybody's going to know who you are anyway.
True.
And what I found was that a lot of my narrators were quite determined. They wanted to be identified with their full names, used in all of the publications, because it was important for them to be heard and to be on record.
Well, sadly, we might have to leave it there. There are lovely messages coming through thanking you both for a great session, and I agree with that. And on behalf of Oral History New South Wales, thank you both so much for joining us, and the Professional Historians Association and State Library. Thank you to everyone at State Library who helped organise this event. A little bit of a promotion for the next History Matters, which is on histories of migration, and the presenters will be Anisa Puri and Alexandra Delios, and that will be chaired by the President of Oral History New South Wales, Maria Savidis. So that should be a great session, and hope you can join us then. If I can see when the date of that is, it will be a month from tonight anyway, because I can't see the date right now. I am going to say another thank you to Margaret and Peg, and thank you to everyone who joined us and for such great questions. That was a really great discussion. A big thank you, and I will hand back over to Rachel Franks from the State Library.
Thank you, Scott and Margaret.
Thank you, Peg and Scott.
Thank you. A terrific conversation tonight, really fabulous. I need a new notepad now. The 4th of November is the next History Matters, so do come back for that. It will be the last History Matters for 2020. And on the 3rd of November, so the Tuesday before, will be the last Scholar Talk for the season. So do come along to that as well if you have time. Kate Forsyth, fellow at the library, will be talking about her research into Australia's first children's author. And if you would like a little bit more disaster this week, on Friday lunchtime, the library is putting on a curator's talk focusing on the 1918 pandemic.